All right, thank you, Whitney. So we're a pretty intimate group tonight, so if you have questions, please ask. I've got about an hour's presentation on making high quality hay. And I want to start out with a little demonstration, and we'll get to the determining moisture part later in the presentation, but I wanted to start the demonstration now, and that's just to show you how to determine dry matter. And dry matter is really key whether you're making haylage or whether you're baling hay. You want to have it dry enough if you're making hay, and kind of in that dry enough range if you're making baleage, and we'll talk about what those parameters are as we go on. Thanks, Whitney. So there's a number of different ways to determine the moisture of forage, and I'm going to demonstrate just one of those tonight. Probably the easiest for you all is to determine moisture using a microwave oven, and we'll talk about that as we go through the presentation. If you turn to, let me see here. It used to be easier to see small numbers, but it looks like page 8 in your presentation. There's one that says determining moisture with a Koster tester. And that's what I'm going to show you tonight. And a Koster tester is just this little thing here. All it is looks like a sieve almost. It's just got a screen bottom in it. And you just put some forage in there. You weigh it when you start, and then you weigh it again when it's dry. And you put it on this part, and all this is kind of like a heating element with a little fan in it. And it just blows hot air up through that forage. In about 30 minutes, it'll dry it out, and we can weigh it again and determine what the dry matter content of that forage is. So we'll do that. This particular model, they use these a lot on dairy farms because it's very important that you're feeding the right amount of dry matter to dairy cows so that milk production doesn't come down. You can actually make these by yourself. You put about 50 grams of forage in there, so we're going to try to get 50 grams in here. I've got this on a scale and I've tared it for the container. I've got 22 grams now. And this is just some, I cut some fescue pasture this afternoon at the research station before I came. I'm at 38. I'm getting close. I'm at 44. I'm at 50 and a half. By the time I get $49. I'm at 50 grams exactly. So I'm just going to stick this on here. It's got a little timer on it. You just turn the timer on. And it's going to start to blow hot air up through that forage. What do you all think this is? This is fresh forage right from the field, right from a pasture I clipped this afternoon. Any ideas? Just write down on your paper what you think the moisture content is on this and what the dry matter is. So, and then we'll check it when it's dry. All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about making high quality hay and haylage. If you have any questions, please ask them as we go through the presentation tonight. I always like to start out and ask people what forage quality is. Lots of different definitions of forage quality. We've got total digestible nutrients, we've got in vitro true dry matter digestibility, we've got crude protein. Those can all help define forage quality, but really the definition that I like the best is the ability of a forage to produce a desired animal response. So if I feed that alfalfa to a dairy cow, it's going to produce milk. That's my desired animal response. If I feed it to a stocker calf, I want to gain weight. If I feed it to my wife's pleasure horse, maybe I just want it to be enough nutrition to maintain its body condition, but not let it get like me. So whatever that is, it's that desired animal response that we're after. There's lots of different factors that impact forage quality. We've got the legume or grass. Generally, legumes tend to be higher in forage quality than grasses. We've got warm season or cool season grass. Generally, cool season grasses like orchard grass and tall fescue will tend to be higher in forage quality than a warm season grass like Bermuda grass or crabgrass. We've got weeds can impact forage quality. We can have stem size impact. Fertilization can impact forage quality. But the single most important factor impacting forage quality, let me see here, I'm not advancing. What? My advancers not working here. Oh, I hear somebody there. The single and most important factor impacting forage quality is stage of maturity at harvest. So more important than species, more important than whether it's a grass or legume, the single most important factor is how mature is it at harvest. And when we make forage late in the spring, forage quality declines very rapidly. This is kind of what happens to forage quality as we go through. So as that plant goes from a leafy stage to what we call the full bloom or the mature stage, where we're in the reproductive stage where we're producing seed, things happen in there. The percentage of leaves on that plant as a percent of total dry matter decreases, protein decreases, minerals tend to decrease. Yield goes up, but so does fiber and lignin. Fiber and lignin, the higher the fiber and the higher the lignin content, lignin is a compound that makes that forage less digestible in the rumen of the animal. As those increase, the digestibility or the forage quality tends to decrease. And the stems increase. This is what happens to digestibility of that forage. So as we go from a leafy stage to a reproductive stage, digestibility decreases. Dry matter intake also decreases. That means the animal can eat less of that forage. So it's kind of a double whammy. The quality of the forage is less for the animal, and it also can eat less of that forage because it's higher in fiber. So it takes longer for that animal to digest that forage. Now, the positive thing is as that plant goes from a leafy vegetative stage to the reproductive stage, yield goes up. Sometimes I think we spend too much time focusing on yield. We want to optimize our yield, but we also want to optimize our forage quality. And that's going to be right here in the center. We're going to make this compromise. We're going to be right here where these lines cross the yield and the forage quality. That's about where we want to harvest our plants. We get a pretty decent yield and we get pretty decent forage quality. And that's going to occur when the grass is at the boot stage. That's what that seed head's just starting to come out to early head stage. If we harvest our forages at that stage, we're going to get a good yield, not the highest yield, but a good yield, and we're going to get good forage quality. And this is just an example of the boot to early head stage. So we call it boot when this last leaf, they call it the flag leaf. When this swells up right before the seed head starts to come out, that's the boot stage. This is actually in the early head stage in this particular photograph. And this was a study that was done a number of years ago. It's in published in Southern Forage's book. And this is tall fescue. And it looked at the stage of harvest and the impact on animal performance. This is stocker calf performance. So we have the late boot stage, so that's what we should be targeting. The crude protein was 13.8%, the digestibility was close to 70%, and the animals gained in this particular study about 1.4 pounds a day. Now, say we maximized our yield, and that means we were in a reproductive stage when we harvested that hay. So the seed was actually forming in that tall fescue when we harvested that hay. I know nobody in this room does that, right? But sometimes it happens. The crude protein dropped from 13.8% to 7.6. Digestibility dropped from 68 to 56. And animal performance dropped about a pound a day on those stocker calves. Hands down, the single most important thing that you can do if you want to increase forage quality is harvest at the late boot to early head stage. So let's talk just a little bit about hay preservation and what's happening when we make hay. And our ultimate objective is to reduce that moisture in that hay down to around 18% as fast as we possibly can. When we do that, we minimize dry matter losses during the curing process. So when we cut that forage plant off, it's not dead, it's still living and it's still respiring. And when it's respiring, it's using up sugars and carbohydrates. The longer it respires before we get it dried out, the higher our dry matter losses is going to be. So we want to make sure that we cut it and get it cured as fast as we possibly can. And we're going to start to limit respiration when we reach 40%. When we harvest a tall fescue and orchard grass plant in the spring in the boot stage, what's the approximate moisture content? Any ideas? Yeah, not bad. So it's going to be about 80% probably. So we got to get to 80 to 40% to stop respiration, and we want to do that as fast as we possibly can. So what it does when we dehydrate that plant to make hay, that's essentially what we're doing. We're drying that plant out. We concentrate the solutes in the cell, and that inhibits microbial growth. Mold is going to grow between 20 and 35% moisture. So we want to definitely get below 20%. For a small square bale, we can harvest around 18 to 20%. We want to be 18 or lower for larger bales. The larger the bale, the harder it is to get moisture out once we compress it into that bale. So as mold grows, it consumes nutrients and causes heating in that bale, and it can produce toxins. We also have a reaction that goes on if we harvest above 20% moisture, in that 20 to 35% called the browning reaction. That's where the microbes grow within that hay because we didn't get enough moisture out of it. And that respiration of the microbes causes that bale to heat up. As that bale heats up, the sugars and the proteins kind of come together, and it causes lower protein availability. So the hay can still test fairly well for protein, but the animals can't utilize that protein because it has formed a complex with the sugars, and we call that the browning reaction. And if this is bad enough and our moisture was high enough when we harvested, we actually can have spontaneous combustion in those. Are you all right? Okay. We can actually have spontaneous combustion, and that's what causes hay fires, is microbial growth in the bales. Go ahead, Whitney. It depends a little bit on the weather. We shouldn't harvest, we should be in fairly good condition about mid-May, and as we get into late May, we'll probably have some seed forming in the tall fescue plant. So we want to make sure that we harvest based on growth stage, not necessarily calendar date. So this is a bale we had at a field day, and this was some cereal rye. And if you all know, it's very hard to cure small grains in the spring for dry hay because the curing conditions are not optimal early in the spring. And small grains, especially if they've been fertilized, can make a pretty heavy hay crop, so it's hard to get them dried out. So this was baled up a little bit too wet. And you can see there was a browning reaction taking place here. And that actually smells fairly sweet. That's kind of a tobacco-ish smell when you have heating in a bale like this. But that protein is not going to be available to the animal. That's what they call heat-damaged protein in that particular sample. And if it gets hot enough, that can actually spontaneously combust and cause barn fires. And we see those now and then throughout Kentucky. So the best way to reduce your risk of hay fire is to get your forage down below 20% moisture before you put it in a hay bale. If you bale it up and it's above 20%, don't stick it in a barn. Let it sit out. Don't stack it up. Leave it spread out in the field. If you think you're above 20% or you didn't measure your moisture and you think your bales are heating, then you can actually stick a thermometer in those moistures and measure the temperature. And there's a range of temperatures in this table. Um, if you're less than 130 degrees, you're in pretty good shape. When you start to creep up to 150, it could go up or it could go down. It's probably going to go up. If you get up to 175 in that bale, so you're sticking a thermometer in that bale and it's 175 degrees, you're on the verge of spontaneous combustion. You should probably call the fire department. And you want to do it before you move the bales. If you've got those bales in a stack and they're almost ready to burst into flames and you pull them apart, what happens? Yeah, you're introducing oxygen into the system.
I had that happen to me, and I called the fire department. They said, "We don't come unless there's a fire."
Did you tell them you're fixing to create one? Yeah.
And we also have, I don't know about Carroll, but in Grayson County, we have hay temperature probes for that reason.
Yeah. So there's a number of different ways you can measure hay temperature.
They're supposed to come. I had a guy with Perry Williams one day. His was 155 degrees. I just sit there with the fire truck while he moved there.
Yeah, yeah.
I had somebody
That's
it. Water hose.
Yeah.
It's just two bales. It's like not just put the fire out. Fire prevention is part of our job.
Yeah, that's right. So when you measure the temperature of the bale, you want to get in about a 1.5 to 3 feet if you can get your probe in there. And there's a number of different types of probes. I brought one. This is actually a moisture meter and a hay probe together. And this is really handy. You can stick this in a bale and measure the temperature really, really easy. You can also do moisture of the bale, and we'll talk more about that. This is really good for temperature. Moisture, these moisture meters, these moisture probes that you stick in, they're kind of marginal for moisture. It depends a little bit on the density of the bale. Will change your readings. But that's pretty handy. You also can just take a steel tube and bend an end down on it and then stick a thermometer down in the haystack, or they make long dial thermometers that has a probe on that you can stick in bales. But the idea is to get it into where the bale is going to be hot, and that's not going to be right on the outside of the bale, but kind of more internally into that bale. There's different methods for estimating moisture, and there's a hand method, not real accurate, but we all do it when we're looking at hay to see if it's ready to bale or not. The crude method, and the older you get, the more experience you get, the better you're going to be at estimating whether it's dry or not. Sometimes hay will still trick you. Twist it and release. If it's brittle and breaks, it's too dry. If it stays or slowly untwists, it's too wet. If it kind of just fluffs back out, then you're in pretty good shape. Silage, you can actually take corn silage and squeeze it. If the ball stays together, then it's too wet. If it falls apart really rapidly, it's too dry. If it falls apart kind of slowly, then you're kind of in the right range. Probably a better way to do it is to use some kind of hay probe, and there's a number of different hay probes on the market. There's this one, which is a Dromovsky hay probe. A really good one is a Delmhorst, which is on here. And they measure not directly, but kind of indirectly through electrical conductance. So the idea is the more moisture there is, the stronger the signal between the two parts of the probe. You'll see there's a little plastic piece on here that separates this. So that stronger the signal, the more moisture is in the hay. Now these are not perfect by any means, but they'll get you in the ballpark. So they're impacted fairly largely by the density of the bale. So if you have a loose bale, they'll tend to read a lower moisture content. If you have a real dense bale, they'll tend to read a little bit higher. So again, 18 to 36 inches in a firm area of the bale. I like to go in on round bales from the side if I'm probing for temperature, not from the center of the, not from the ends of the bale, but from the side of the bale. And you want to take several readings and get an average. Sometimes you'll hit a wet spot in the bale and it'll be real high, but most of the other spots in the bale will be fairly low. And you want to probe multiple bales. Probably the best way to determine bale moisture is to put a square baler in the field. And if you make a small square bale, you'll know real fast if it's heavy, that it's too moist to be baling. The larger round bales, it's kind of hard for us to gauge because we're not lifting those up. So we're measuring now with a Koster tester, and that's just all it is a heating element with a fan that blows hot air through that forage. It's pretty accurate method because we're actually measuring the weight of the forage before we dry it and after we dry it, and then we can calculate dry matter from those two numbers. Takes about 30 minutes to an hour depending on how much forage you put in there and how wet it is. So you weigh it fresh, you dry it and reweigh it, and then you dry it and reweigh it again, and if it doesn't change moisture, then you'll know that it's dry. And there's a little formula at the bottom here to calculate the dry matter. Probably the easiest way to determine moisture in your forage is with a dry matter, with a microwave oven. And Whitney or Carol can help you do that. We have a method for that. Very highly accurate. Takes about 20 minutes to do. We weigh a fresh sample, usually put it on a paper plate or some kind of a container. So we get a weight in a fresh sample, and then we microwave it on high for 3 minutes, and then we reweigh, and then we microwave it again for 2 minutes, and we reweigh, and we keep doing that until the weight doesn't change anymore. Then we know it's dry, and we take the fresh weight and the dry weight, and we use the same formula to determine the dry matter content of the forage. So that's a really good way to do it. Everybody's got a microwave. The only thing you'll need is some kind of a small scale, like a postal scale that weighs in grams or ounces or something. Why the water? As the hay gets dry, there's less stuff that absorb that radiation. Exactly. So it helps keep from damaging the microwave oven. So every time I do this, I'll just put a fresh cup of cool water in there to absorb it, especially as it gets dry. Oh yeah. Yeah. Was it melting? Yeah. I like that story. You're burning hemp in the microwave. All right, I just want to mention hay preservatives, and some people will use preservatives. Anybody using preservatives in the room? So preservatives they're not a panacea. They're not some kind of a miracle, but they can help you bale hay that's a little bit too wet to be putting in the bale. The goal, there's several goals here. We can speed up harvest, and there's two categories. There's things that helps the forage dry out faster. There are things like potassium carbonate can help the forage dry out faster by reducing the waxy cuticle on the outside of the plant. But more commonly, it's propionic acid that inhibits microbial growth. Apply both of these as a spray. You want to get uniform coverage. For the potassium carbonate, you'll spray it as you mow it to help it dry out faster. For the buffered propionic acid, you're going to spray it as it goes into the baler. And there's other hay preservatives out there, but we know from research that buffered propionic acid works if you use it correctly. It's going to allow you to harvest that hay in that range of about 20 to 30% moisture. 30's pushing it a little bit, but 20 or 25 is going to be, it's going to be able to inhibit that microbial growth in the bale. So again, we use buffered propionic acid. Sometimes they add a little bit of acetic acid to that mixture. It helps to maintain the color of the forage as it goes in to the bale. You can use it on both grass and legumes. Yeah. And it's going to preserve hay in that range of 20 to 30%. So you can't put sopping wet hay into that bale and expect this to work. It's going to be when that hay's just a little bit too dry to be baling. A little bit too moist. Sure.
Check the hay in the windrow and get a moisture reading of 15 or whatever it is. As soon as I bale it, I check it with the probe, and it goes up. Is that the density?
So how are you checking it in the windrow?
With the windrow tester in the 5-gallon bucket.
Yeah. So you brought up, and I forgot to mention that. So you can buy an attachment. It can either be attachment for this probe, like a Delmhorst has a windrow attachment, or you can buy one that does the windrow. They tend not to be quite as accurate because the density in the 5-gallon bucket is not going to be the same as the bale. Right. So the best way to check it would be with a microwave oven. I know nobody likes to do that, but that's the most accurate way to check it. But the windrow attachment tends to be the least accurate. It's probably going to be more accurate to use the probe into the compressed bale. All right, so again, buffered propionic acid is going to preserve hay by inhibiting microbial growth for hay that's in that range of 20 to 30%. And the application rate is going to vary. So the drier the hay, the less propionic acid you're going to need to put on it. As it gets moisture, you're going to need to put on about 12 to 16 pounds per ton of hay is going to be the application rate. And you can actually calibrate the sprayers that come for the hay preservatives. And if it's above 30%, don't bale it. Wait for it to dry out a little bit more. So when do you use it? You know, in my mind, the place for preservatives is when the hay's almost dry enough, but it's going to rain. So it's not quite dry enough to bale, but rain is going to be coming almost for sure. If it's not going to rain, just leave it sit out a little bit longer and let it dry out. So just some best management practices for making high quality hay.
Is that another class, sir?
What's that?
Knowing whether it's going to rain or not.
You know, if I could predict the rain, I would be a millionaire. So it's hard to predict the rain. So that's right. That's it. Yeah, that's how our neighbors determined when I was growing up, they would cut hay about 3 days after my dad would cut his. Because my dad's motto when he was mowing hay is that you've got to look straight ahead, not up when you're mowing hay. So yeah. Right. So yes, it can be used for any class of livestock. So propionic acid is actually one of the volatile fatty acids that is produced in the rumen of the animal. So it's not something that's not already found in the animal. It does slightly change the taste of the hay. Sometimes when you're making horse hay and you've used buffered propionic acid on it, it'll take the horse a day or two to get adjusted to it, but they usually adjust to it pretty well. All right. So dry matter losses occur during harvesting with hay. So you're going to have higher dry matter losses during the harvesting um, process with hay versus haylage or silage. And they can be anywhere from 15 to 30%. So no matter how good of a job you do when you're preserving, making hay, you're always going to have dry matter losses, because that when you cut that plant, it's not dead, it's still respiring. And you're going to get anywhere from about 15 to 30% dry matter losses. The more you beat that hay around, especially if it's got a lot of clover in it, the more leaves you lose, and that's going to be a higher dry matter loss. So some best management practices for hay. Make sure you cut at the right stage of growth, so at that boot or early bloom in legumes. You want to mow it early in the day. That's going to maximize drying time. And there's some debate on that. People in the western United States will tend to mow it in late afternoon, and you'll tend to have a higher amount of sugars in that forage if you mow it in late afternoon. But it gets cool in the high mountain areas in the evening, so that reduces respiration that first night, and it's dry. So they can get away with that. In our part of the country where we're fighting for just having enough days to get it cured, we want to mow it in the morning as soon as the dew gets off of it, maximize that first day drying time. Use a mower conditioner. We want to crush the stems, especially important on first cutting grass, because we're going to have, in our typical grasses, orchard grass and tall fescue, we're going to have reproductive growth in that first cutting, and they're going to have stems, and you want to crush those stems to let that moisture out. So using a properly adjusted mower conditioner is an important part of getting it to cure faster. You want to put it in a wide swath. I can't tell you how many times you drive through the countryside and somebody's mowing hay, and they've got the wings on the back of the mower conditioner set in, and it's putting it in almost a windrow. So ideally you want to open those up, and that lets it come out and be in a wider swath. The wider the swath, the more that forage is going to be able to have sunlight fall on it and help dry it out quicker. So that's something simple that you can do. And then after that starts to dry out on top, if you want to come back and tether it, you can tether it to throw it out and expose the underside of the hay to solar radiation. So make a wide swath. You want to mow it, rake it about 40 to 50% moisture. So you're going to start at 80% moisture. When it's about down to 40% moisture, you can start to rake it. This is especially important if you've got a lot of clover in your hay, or if you're working with alfalfa, because the drier it gets, every time you touch that hay, you're going to have leaf loss, and that can really reduce forage quality in our legumes. Dry hay, yeah. And then you want to bale it in that 18 to 20% moisture range. And by baling it in this range, you're going to reduce leaf loss. If it gets too dry and you start to bale that hay, you're going to lose a lot of leaves, especially in our legumes. If you're above this range, you're going to get mold growth in there. So when you're in that range or below that range, you're going to inhibit mold growth, and you're also going to reduce chance of hay fires. And then store under cover, and we'll talk a little bit more about hay storage in a bit. Is there any questions on dry hay before we move on to baleage? Okay, so the question is, what about cutting height? And the cutting height is going to depend on the species that you're working with. And so, for example, something like tall fescue or orchard grass, they store their energy for regrowth in the stem base. So when we cut them too close, we expose more soil to sunlight, and that's going to dry the soil out and increase the soil and ground temperature of the plant, and we're removing their carbohydrates or their stored energy for regrowth. So one of the worst things that's probably happened to orchard grass is the advent of the of the disc mower because we can mow so close to the soil surface with the disc mower if we're not careful. We want to leave about at least 3 to 4 inches with orchard grass and tall fescue, and that's going to increase both persistence of those forage crops and productivity of those forage crops. If we mow them close, we're going to lose orchard grass stands pretty quick. So something like a summer annual like sorghum Sudan grass or pearl millet, we want to raise that cutting height up to around 6 inches would be ideal, 6 to 8 inches. And that's going to speed up regrowth on those summer annual crops. Good, Whitney, or okay? Okay. This is just a photograph of a new type of baler. This actually bales the hay up and then wraps the bale as it goes along. And we have a producer outside of Princeton, Kentucky that actually purchased one of these bales. A pretty efficient system. Not inexpensive though. All right, just a little bit about the biology of silage preservation. So with dry hay, the idea was to get the moisture out of the hay, concentrate the solutes in the cells that are left, and that inhibits microbial growth. With silage, it's a little bit different. The idea is that we want to rapidly reduce the pH of the hay, and we do that through fermentation. So we ferment sugars and carbohydrates in the plant to lactic acid. And lactic acid bacteria are the ones that do that, and they occur naturally in the environment. So when we exclude oxygen, lactic acid bacteria are anaerobic. That means they grow without oxygen. And they will take the sugars and the carbohydrates and convert them into lactic acid. And that's what we're seeing happening here. So the lactic acid are starting to grow, and they're taking the sugars and carbohydrates, making lactic acid, so the pH of the silage decreases as they grow. And you'll see here the lactic acid are increasing, the lactic acid bacteria are increasing, they're creating lactic acid, the pH goes down. At some point, the pH gets low enough that they actually kill themselves off, and we enter what we call our stable phase of silage. So we're going to go anywhere from reduce the pH anywhere, depending on the type of forage that we have, from about 3.8 to 5. So something like alfalfa will be on the higher end of the range. Something like corn silage, where there's plenty of sugars and carbohydrates in the kernel of the corn, will be down that 3.8 to 4 range. And then the acid is actually what's preserving silage. So that reduction in pH is what's actually keeping microbes from growing in that silage. And that's going to be stable until we open that silo up and introduce oxygen back into that silo. An update here. Get rid of this thing. All right. So let's talk a little bit about round bale silage. This has been gaining some popularity. Do people in here make round bale silage? Good. Have you had pretty good luck with it? Yeah. Okay.
I have a question. I know some handouts that said not to keep it past year. I had some that I wrapped it well, but I put the plain plastic on it, and there's no holes in it. Will that last longer than a year?
So the question is the general recommendation is that we keep round bale silage, we feed it within a season of making it is the ideal situation. Can you keep it longer than a year? The answer is probably yes, but it depends a little bit on how much plastic you put on it. If you put, 8 or 10 layers of plastic on it, then you're going to be able to keep it a little bit longer. Yeah.
So how do you know if it is bad? How do you know if you have it bad?
It'll smell rancid when you open it up. Yeah. So silage will be generally stable until you introduce oxygen back into it. So the thing about the round bale package is that it's not an ideal ensiling package. So the ideal, because it's got a lot of surface area to volume ratio. So there's a lot of outside of a small bale to the volume of that bale. In a big silo, there's a smaller surface area to volume ratio. And in like a conventional silo, it's more oxygen tight than plastic. We think of plastic as being oxygen impermeable, but really there is a diffusion of oxygen through even plastic layers on a bale. So there's a number of advantages to round bale silage, and it's a low capital investment, so we're not having to pour a concrete silo or a bunker silo. Be very high feed quality because we're able to harvest the forage on time. And remember that timely harvest is the #1 factor impacting forage quality. Harvest losses tend to be lower because we're handling the forage at a higher moisture content when we're ensiling it, so we have less least loss. Wrapped bales can be transported if they're individually wrapped. Smaller amounts of forage can be ensiled, so you don't have to fill a big silo all at one time. And we don't have any really special machinery needed for feeding this. We can feed it just like we would a round bale. Disadvantages, again, we mentioned the high surface area to volume ratio, so it's not an ideal siling package. There's lots of places in terms of surface area for the plastic to break or a bird to peck through or an animal to scratch a hole in the plastic. And once that happens, oxygen enters that bale and that can ruin that bale. The plastic cost, of course, is $4 to $6 a bale. It's probably a reasonable range. With improved balers, the chop is becoming less of a problem. We have balers now that will actually chop the forage as they enter the baler, and that can help get a denser bale. The denser the bale, the better, because what you want to do is get all the oxygen out. If it's a loose bale, there'll be more oxygen within that bale. Some balers can't handle wet hay. Bales can be heavy, especially if they're baled a little bit on the high end of the moisture range. We can get holes in plastic, and then we've got to get rid of the plastic. I think, to me, that's one of the biggest negatives of bale silage is you got a bunch of plastic left over, and nobody really wants it because it's kind of dirty plastic too. So at the end of the day, it's a good alternative, but you got to realize it's not a perfect ensiling package. So like you said, generally speaking, if you can feed up what you made last year this season, that's the ideal situation. Some best management practices for round bale silage. We want to make sure we cut at the correct stage of maturity. And again, that stage of maturity, #1 factor impacting forage quality. Grasses at the late boot to early head, legumes at early bloom. We want to use a mower conditioning to enhance wilding, so we want to wild it again as fast as we possibly can down to our ensiling moisture. And again, that's using a mower conditioner, and having a wide swath is going to expose more of that to solar radiation and get you down to your wilded moisture. So we don't want to ensile forage at 80% moisture, so standing forage. We want to wild it down to that range of 55 to 65% would be ideal for ensiling that forage. When we're baling, if we use a lower ground speed, we tend to make a denser bale. We want to use plastic or untreated sisal twine or net wrap. Treated sisal twine can actually react with the UV inhibitors in the plastic and cause the plastic to break down. And we probably want to make a little smaller bales, especially if they're on the high side of the moisture range, to keep the weight manageable. And then if we're wrapping individual bales, the ideal situation would be we would move the hay bale from the field to the site where it's going to be stored, and then wrap it at the site where it's going to be stored, and dump it and don't touch it again. Every time we touch a bale, once it's wrapped, you've got a chance of putting a hole in the plastic. Ideally, we don't want to make more bales in a day than we can wrap. So at the end of the day, when we're done, we want everything that we baled to be wrapped at the end of the day. We don't want to sit around for 2 or 3 days. Bales tend to squat and they don't wrap as well. So just bale enough, mow enough, and bale enough that you can make it up in one day. Use a good quality wrap that's designed for bale silage, not that has UV inhibitors in it. I like to see a minimum, we used to say a minimum of 4 layers of plastic, but I really think we're better off with a minimum of 6 layers of plastic on a bale that we're wrapping. If you get in that 6 plus range, then there's less chance that we're going to have problems with oxygen getting into that bale. If you're selling it or you want to keep it longer, then you may want to push that up to 8 to 10 layers of plastic on that bale. One thing that you have to do with bale silage is watch it for holes. If you get a hole in there and oxygen gets into that bale and you don't patch that hole, it's going to ruin that bale. So make sure if you have damage to the plastic, get on it and do it with a UV stabilized tape that's designed for silage film or greenhouse applications. If you get a UV, don't use duct tape because it doesn't have any UV inhibitors and it'll break down. And then again, we talked about feeding the same season ideally, or that following season. It doesn't keep as well as a conventional silo. If we have a conventional silo that's that we did a good job packing and a good job sealing, and we don't open it, that can keep for years and years and years. Bale silage doesn't keep as well as that. I just wanted to mention this because this is something that we're seeing more as we move forward, and this is something called sweet hay. Anybody ever hear that? So there's kind of a range. So when we make dry hay, we want it to be below 20% moisture. When we make silage, we want to be above 55% moisture, between that 55 and 65%. So there's always been this what I call the no man's land between that 20 and 55% moisture, where neither hay nor silage really does a perfect job of preserving that moisture. But we are seeing more people wrapping hay in that range, and that range of 20 to 40 to 50%. So it's almost dry, and people are actually wrapping it, and it actually undergoes what I think is a partial fermentation in there. And they're using this kind of as a rain management tool. I met a real interesting hay producer in Ohio that was making what he called the sweet hay when he was trying to make dry hay and it looked like it was going to rain. Instead of using a buffered propionic acid, he would roll it up and wrap it, and it would undergo a partial fermentation. It kind of has a sweet smell to it. And so this kind of stimulated some research that we did this summer, and I'll show you a couple of slides from that. I had an undergraduate intern this summer at the research station that ensiled tall fescue all the way from standing plant to dry enough for hay. Every several hours he would make a silo. So this was the impact that dry matter ensiling had on the final pH. Remember, the lower the pH, the better. So this started here. This is the dry matter. So this was a standing forage. It was about 30% dry matter or 70% moisture, and then it got drier. So this student for 3 days sampled that forage every 3 to 4 hours, and every 3 to 4 hours, he made a little, what we called a mini silo. So he collected forage from the field, and he put it in a vacuum bag, like a food saver bag, sucked the air out of it and sealed it. And then it ferments, just like it would in the silo. And he did that for 3 days, every several hours. And this was what happened with the pH. So as that forage got drier and was approaching 100% dry matter, the fermentation was less and less and less. So the pH was higher and higher and higher. So as we got in this no man's range here, we were getting some fermentation, some lowering of the pH, but it wasn't in this ideal range. So it was going through a partial fermentation. So what we were interested in is what impact does this have on the nutritive value or the forage quality of that silage? And this was what happened to crude protein. So as that forage got drier, crude protein content dropped, as you can see from this graph. And for the most part, we were meeting the needs of a dry brood cow. This was a little bit mature when the farm crew cut this particular field. So we're not in that 10 to 12% range that I would like to see. We're more in that 8 to 9% range here. But as it got drier, crude protein content decreased, and that commonly happens in hay. When we go from a standing forage crop to dry hay, we're going to lose some crude protein, somewhere in that range of about 2 to 3% crude protein just in that curing process. So this was the impact on total digestible nutrients, which is an estimate of the energy in that forage. And what we found was it had very little impact whether we ensiled it when it was almost dry or at the ideal moisture. It had little impact on total digestible nutrients. So what's the take home? The take home is that we can probably use this as a rain management tool if we're wrapping hay, as long as we exclude oxygen. So it's super important if you're going to go in this range of 20 to 50% moisture and try to ensile that forage that we put plenty of plastic on there, because we need to exclude that hay, that oxygen from that hay.
See, that's what I think people aren't doing is if they're using it, if they're wrapping dry hay, they're using it instead of a barn and they're putting very little plastic.
Yes.
Now, down our way, we wrap it just like it's top. You're getting 3 to 4 turns on it, which would be 6 to 8. And we put it exactly just like you're going to style it, because it's not going in the barn without, because they know they've been wrapping silage hay.
So
They're wrapping it just like it was, but it is lower moisture hay because they're not putting it in a barn.
yeah, and has it been keeping pretty well and feeding well?
I
Yeah.
like it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've baled some haylage before, and like we were talking about before, some disadvantages of being heavy on the part of the equipment, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
You let that dry out better, and it makes everything easier.
Yeah.
It's still good. It's still good.
And I think as long as you get enough plastic on that, you'll probably be all right. Now, the one thing that you probably lose when you do this is aerobic stability. So when you introduce oxygen back into that silage, when you take the plastic off, it won't be as stable as it would be as if you had a lower pH of the silage. So that can decrease bunk life, but that's probably not as important in a beef cow operation as it would be, say, in a dairy operation. Yeah, exactly. That, probably not. I think the worst thing that you could have is off fermentation and then form butyric acid. And butyric acid is like well, you'll be able to tell if it's bad. It smells like rotted butter. So that can happen in that range. Probably the worst problem would be clostridial fermentation, which would happen at a higher moisture range. Yeah, or not dry enough when you ensiled it. So this is what Carol was just talking about. So as you let a round bale sit outside, you're going to get a weathered layer on that round bale. Everybody's seen that, and that's generally refusal. So the animals tend not to clean that up as well. They're going to pull at that and push it on the ground. And the question is, well, I've only got 5 or 6 inches of rot around the edge of the bale. It's not that big of a deal. Well, that's about a quarter of this bale. So when we look at this, this is just a table that shows on a 5-foot diameter bale, if we've got 6 inches of wastage on the outside, that's about a third of the total volume of that bale. So that's really important to remember on a round bale. That outer edge makes up a large volume of that bale. So when we lose 5 or 6 inches, we're losing a significant amount of that hay.
Yeah, you better lose that
Yeah, that's right. That's not a choice, I'm afraid. So that's a good reason for wrapping that hay, because you're not losing that outside edge, which can be anywhere from 25 to 30% of the bale. So let's talk just a little bit about storage. So this was some work that was done at the University of Kentucky a while back, and when you stored hay on a rock pad, the dry matter losses were 10% compared to on the ground was 30%. So what's the difference? Why is it so much less with that rock pad? That's right, you're breaking ground contact when you're putting on that rock pad. We often think of rain penetrating from the top of the bale, but probably much worse for bale spoilage is wicking that water up from the soil. So by putting it on a rock pad, we dramatically reduced dry matter losses. Probably one of the worst things we can do is when we store hay in tree lines or along trees, it doesn't let the hay dry out and it causes greater storage losses. So getting them away from tree lines would be ideal. When we stack hay, we want to stack bales end to end in rows, and we want to run them down the slope. So if we have a gentle slope, we want to run the bales down that slope. And then instead of stacking the bales beside each other like that, you want to leave about 3 to 4 feet between the rows of bales. That allows them to shed water and allows that water to run down the slope. If we stack bales on the side slope in a long line like this, they'll catch water in the bottom of the bale. So net wrap in this particular study had a dry matter loss of on the ground, had a dry matter loss of 23% versus twine on the ground of 30%. So it was a little bit better than twine, but still pretty high dry matter loss. This is one thing that's never really caught on, and I'm not sure why, but even instead of using net wrap, but like a plastic wrapped around that bale instead of net wrap, it significantly reduced dry matter losses, 5%. And again, it's because it's one, shedding water, two, it's breaking that ground contact and keeping water from being wicked up by that bale.
They only last about 2 years.
The plastic, yeah. Yeah, ideally you would feed the hay that's outside up first if you could. Yep. There was a baler a long time ago called M&W. Anybody hear of an M&W baler? They actually had that option to wrap it in plastic like that. So if you're going to put hay in a stack, yep. That's the point. Yeah. Yeah, putting it underneath a conventional shed. Yeah. So the point is the dry matter loss, that plastic greatly reduces the dry matter losses. If you're going to stack hay, you've got to cover it with a tarp. So don't stack it up and then don't put a tarp over it, because it catches water and the whole stack just rots to pieces. Okay, so make sure you put a tarp over it if you're going to stack it. And we see people do this all the time when you're driving through the countryside. They'll stack it up and not put a tarp on it. Tarps are no fun, right? I mean, they're kind of a pain to do. I think I would rather put some plastic on those bales. Yeah, that's right. The best storage, is just sticking them in a barn. If you got storage under a roof, put as much hay under that roof as you possibly can, and put your best hay under a roof. Feed it last, and feed what you put outside first. Is there any questions on hay storage? Go ahead. So I'll just tell you, we did a trial on a farm when I was in Virginia. I was in Virginia 17 years at Virginia Tech, and we did a trial on this farm, and they hadn't had dairy cows there in 20 years, and we found some alfalfa bales in the hay mow, and so they were probably 20 years plus old, and they still tested well. but they were off the ground and out of the sunlight. So hay can last, dry hay can last a long time if it's undercover and ground contact is broken with it. Some of the vitamins in dry hay will break down over time, like vitamin A will break down faster than energy. Energy will stay fairly stable, and crude protein will stay fairly stable in a hay bale as long as it's not being weathered. What, there was a question over here? The what?
That was my question.
Okay. Yeah. All right. So let's just talk a little bit about the economics of haymaking, because I think this is critical that people understand how much it costs to make hay. And you can kind of divide costs into what we call fixed costs and variable costs. So fixed costs are things that don't change, and that's like machinery costs. So if I buy a baler and a tractor, whether it sits in that barn and I make 5 bales of hay or 500 bales of hay, I still got to pay the bank for that tractor, right? That's a fixed cost or a machinery cost. And they don't change with use. So the baler's always going to cost the same. The tractor's always going to cost the same. Now the fixed cost can decrease as we start to use it more and we spread it out over a larger amount of hay. And I'll show you a diagram of that in a minute. The variable costs are the out-of-pocket costs. So when I make a bale of hay, it's going to cost me so much diesel fuel, and I've got to put twine on that bale or net wrap or whatever. So those are what we call variable costs or out-of-pocket costs. Include things like fuel, oil, and repairs. And the variable costs increase with use. So the more tons of hay I make, the more variable cost I'm going to have for the total hay crop. But they change very little per ton of bale. So if it costs me $10 for fuel, oil, lube, and twine, it's going to cost $10 for the first bale, $10 for the second bale, $10 for the third bale. That cost doesn't decrease as I make more bales. It includes repairs, yeah. So in the older the equipment, the higher the repair cost is going to be, right? So this is just a machinery investment. So, and I'm not saying these are right numbers or wrong numbers. You can argue with me all day long about these numbers. It doesn't matter. But the point that I want to make is that if you're going to have a hay operation, you're going to have significant input in machinery costs. And a lot of times we'll use our tractors for more than the hay operation. We'll use them for feeding or for cleaning the barn or whatever, or for the tobacco crop, and we can spread that cost out across different enterprises within the farm. But the point is that we've got significant investment. And what I want to point out is that if we're in a cow-calf operation and we're making hay, that hay is not the product that we're selling. The calf is the product that we're selling. So you've got to remember that. If you're in a cash hay operation, that becomes different, right? Because that bale is that final product. So I like to always equate to the number of cows you could buy. So if I had new machinery, I could buy 80 cows. If I used machinery, I could buy 50 cows. Those cows are producing a product that you're actually selling. So that's important to keep in mind. All right, this is the impact on the number of acres harvested on the machinery cost, and this is dollars per ton. What I don't want to get into the actual cost, but what I want to show you is that as you use machinery more, your machinery cost per ton of hay decreases, right? Because I'm running it over a larger acreage. Probably the worst thing you can do is buy a bunch of machinery and then not use it, right? That's the worst possible thing you can do in terms of a hay operation. What you want to do is you want to run that machinery over the largest amount of acreage that you possibly can, and that's going to reduce your machinery costs greatly per ton of hay. So let's just talk about owning versus buying hay. So my choice is either I own a bunch of hay equipment, I make my own hay, or I buy my hay, right? So our economists say own the hay if the total cost is less than purchasing the hay, and then you also got to think about risk factors. So maybe I can't get hay if it's a dry year. plus the hassle of buying hay, because there is a hassle factor buying hay, right? And then the other thing you've got to think about, so if I've got the same amount of acreage and I decide that I'm going to buy hay, then I can have more animals on that acreage, right? Because I can use that other additional hay acreage for grazing in some cases. So you need to take that into account also. If you own your equipment, if hay purchase or custom options are limited. So if I can't get somebody to make my hay for me, or I can't buy hay, then I of course have to have hay equipment. Own if it's a custom business. So if you have a viable hay business where you're actually selling hay, or you're making hay for other people, then it makes sense to own equipment. Own if it's a grazing management tool. So I've got pastures that are getting out of control in the spring because it's growing faster than the cattle can eat it, and I'm going to harvest that extra forage for hay. That may be a good reason to own equipment. So just kind of a summary, know the costs associated with owning machinery, and just realize that it's going to cost you something to own that machinery. Ask if there are alternatives to owning machinery. Can I stockpile for winter grazing to reduce the amount of hay I need? Can I use rotational stocking to increase pasture productivity? If we implement rotational stocking, we improve pasture productivity by about 30%. Can I work with my neighbor to cut hay on shares? Can I get somebody to harvest it? What are the options other than owning machinery? Having cash flow to pay for machinery doesn't always make it a profitable decision. And realize that owning machinery is not bad, but it's got to increase the bottom line. And you got to ask yourself, is there something I could do that's going to improve the amount of money I'm putting in the bank at the end of the year versus owning that machinery? And then size machinery to achieve lower costs. So this is just a budget of total and fixed variable costs. And again, it's not written in stone. It's going to change from farm to farm, but I think it's reasonable. So the total fixed and variable costs, and that includes things like fertilizer and lime, fuel and lube and so forth, and then machinery cost and other fixed costs is about $120 a ton. Yeah, you know, if you own all your equipment and you're not buying any, you don't owe anybody any money, that's going to be less than this. But at some point, you're still going to have to replace that machinery. The point is that you need to go, each of you need to think about how much it costs you to make that hay, and just write it down and figure out for your operation what you have in that hay. A lot of people don't know that, and that's a good exercise to go through if you ever want to do that. So it comes out to about $120 a ton, and it's really going to be between 80 and probably 120 a ton, if you're honest with yourself. So I just pulled this off of Facebook Marketplace before I came this afternoon. Clean 2020 tall fescue, net wrapped, rolled with a John Deere baler, good tight 1,200 pound bale. I don't know if it really weighs 1,200 pounds. It may or may not. Some of these new balers, they'll weigh a little bit more than you think. Rolls, $25 a piece. $25. Nortonville. Yeah. 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 So the point I want to make with this is that you got to be careful when you buy hay for $25 a roll, right? It might be a bunch of weeds in it. But the point is, I think there's an opportunity there. This guy has not sat down and figured out how much it costs him to make hay, because he cannot make a ton of hay for $50. Just not possible. And that's an opportunity for you if you're a cow-calf producer. If I could buy my hay for a reasonable price, not have to mess with machinery and get decent quality hay, then that's that could be a profitable opportunity for me. Last thing, and I'm finished, is that the good Lord made some efficient harvesting machines, and that's cows. And the longer you can let them graze and harvest their own forage and distribute their own manure, the better off you are. So think about things like maybe having some annuals in your system, using stockpile tall fescue for winter grazing. Really making an effort to do that, that's going to reduce the amount of hay that you need in your system. And ultimately, we're always going to need some hay. So I'm not telling you that you're never going to need hay. You're going to need hay. And you're going to have droughts and floods and so forth. And you want to have all of your barns filled with dry hay if you can, because it's going to keep for a long time. But we should really be striving to reduce the amount of hay that we need in our cow-calf system, because that's going to increase the profitability of the whole system. All right, is there any questions?
I know when I started, I had somebody come over and sell my hay, and they quit. And I tried to get somebody else to come over and do it. It was just a no-brainer, just go out and buy my equipment.
Just buy equipment?
Just buy it, and it was cheaper.
So that's the decision that you have to make, and each one of you have to make that. Is it going to be more profitable for me to buy hay or buy equipment? And it's going to depend a little bit on the size of your operation. If you've got 40 acres of hay you're making, going out and buying a bunch of new equipment is probably not going to be a real profitable decision long term.
Well, I didn't buy new, but I bought,
Right.
enough to justify what I had to do.
Right. Well,
Different people too. If you're somebody that's going to be worried about what you're getting and whether it was rained on, whether it's weeds in it and all that stuff,
yeah.
that can worry yourself to death.
Yep, that's right.
You got to worry about if they're going to be there.
Yeah.
Sometimes they,
You have to have to buy hay, it'd be ideal to have a relationship with somebody that you know is going to make good quality hay. They're going to cut it at the right time. They're going to control weeds in their hay field. So,
Chris, on these large silage bales, when you open a row, you know, I put the ink caps on there and all that. When I open that, how fast do you actually feed that?
I'd like to see you feed ideally you'd be pulling a bale off a day, to keep it from deteriorating too fast. So you have to have enough animals to do that with, ideally. Now, the rate at which the silage deteriorates is going to be less when you're feeding it in the winter months, because it's going to be cool, versus the summertime when the rate of deterioration is going to be much higher.
Okay, and then
Yeah.
I put so many bales out, and I mean, I have a feeding barn that I feed on the roof. So how many bales, I mean, I normally put several bales out. How long do I need to wait in between, feeding some more? You know, they eat it down, but they don't eat all of that. You wait till they clean most of that up, or you just wait.
If it's a good quality silage, they'll clean it up pretty well, I think. A couple of years ago, when I first came to Kentucky in 2017, there was a young lady, and she was feeding a cow herd not far from Princeton, and she had made some cereal rye baleage, and the cereal rye had gotten too far along. Remember, we talked about stage of maturity at harvest? Well, cereal rye goes from being okay to terrible in a matter of days in the spring. And she had made it when it was way too mature, so it was almost like she was feeding straw. She about starved those poor cows to death trying to make them eat that winter. I mean, they were skin and bones by the time they got to spring. So the point that I want to make is that bale silage is not some kind of a miracle crop. If you put bad quality forage into a bale, it's going to be bad quality forage when it comes out of that ensiling process. So it's really important to cut it in a timely manner.
spear that hay and take it out to them, and it smells like you might take a bite of it.
Yeah.
Well, you always have spots. So
Yeah.
A spot where something's not going to in, it's got, they don't eat that up.
Yeah. So I would put out enough so that you're probably every couple of days you're taking more out. I mean, by taking it out, there's going to be less of a chance of it deteriorating in the air.
But as far as hysteria building up in, does it take a while for that to happen?
Yes, it's going to take a while, and listeria, is a problem with higher moisture forage. So if you're wielding the proper moisture, you're going to have limited problems with listeria.
I have a question from the chat. It said, how long do we have from the time we cut hay until the time we put it in the wrapper before we start losing value on it?
Regardless of what you do, whether you're making dry hay or silage, the minute you cut it and decide to make it into conserved forage, you're losing quality. So you're going to decrease it. Harvest losses will be less with silage versus dry hay. It's going to depend a little bit on, so Carol's asking whether, it, yeah, yeah. So, well, you want to wilt it. So depending on your wilting conditions, it can be the same day. You can cut it one day and bale it up and wrap it the same day in some cases, if your curing conditions are really good. If they're marginal curing conditions, like early spring, it may take a day or two to get it wilted to the proper moisture. The key is getting it to the right moisture, and for bale silage, we want that moisture to be in that range of 55 to 65% ideally for optimum fermentation.
I mean, you cut real thick hay and put it in the windrow, so you ain't got to rake it, you just pick it up from the baling. It can be wet in there.
That's a really good point you brought up. So I like, even for baleage, a lot of people will like to skip that step of raking with baleage, and they do exactly what you say. So you put the wings on the mower conditioner and you put it in the windrow. Well, it's going to get dry on top, but in there it can be just like you cut it, and that's not ideal for ensiling. What you want to do is get that windrow spread out and get it all wilted down to a uniform moisture, bring it back up into a windrow with a rake, and then bale it. Yeah. All right, let's weigh this real quick, see what it was. So this dried for 60 minutes. We had 50 grams in here when we started. And we've got 16 grams left in there. So because we put 50 in, we can just double everything, and that's going to tell us what the dry matter is. So this dry matter could be a little bit longer drying, I think. But this would be, yep, 30% moisture, 30% dry matter in here, which is probably fairly reasonable, 20 to 30% dry matter.
Baling hay, I know some instead of stockpiling or feeding stockpile fish, like a couple weeks ago, and they will third and fourth cut. Curing in these conditions takes longer.
Yep. So curing in late fall, you're not going to have the day length or the solar radiation that you would have in summertime, so it's going to take longer to cure. Really, to be honest with you, if you've got a fence around it, I think you're better off to graze it than making a fourth cutting. Yeah. So yeah, it drives me batty when I drive by a field and somebody's in there in November making a hay cutting and it's got a fence around it. I'm like, what in the world are they doing? That will save well, and I mean you can graze stockpile grass up into January and February in some years. The quality goes down as you get into later winter, but still can be pretty easy. Yeah. That's right.
I baled something for 2 weeks ago, John. Why? I can't pass it. I ain't got no water. I ain't got no choice.
That's a good question. It was.
One day, later, 2 days. I rolled it. I'm feeding it now. They're loving it.
Was it dry when you rolled it, or was it still a little moist?
No, it's pretty good shape.
Pretty good.
Dust was really rolling.
Yeah.
We had a real exceptional, well, when the pine dried out this year, we had a really exceptional hay season. My first cut, I put 65 acres on the ground. That tractor tethered right behind the mower. I don't have conditioner.
Mhm.
And we were belting next day at noon.
So you had good curing conditions then. Yeah.
It was dry, and it was dry hay.
Yeah.
It dried right, and it was exceptional. I've never seen hay fluff up like it did. It was fluffing up so much that I actually pulled the V-rake out of the field because it was balling up and went outside the delivery rake.
Mm.
There's no way to rake it without balling it up behind it.
Yeah. That's good.
Now,
Hay that I get in trouble with is hay that's got a lot of crabgrass.
Yeah. 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 Hard to get it cured.
Dry, you can bale it up and it'll might near heat on you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, crabgrass is hard to cure, and Bermuda grass will seem drier than it is. I don't know. Probably don't have a lot of Bermuda grass in this area, but as you get into western Kentucky, there's more and more Bermuda grass, and that will trick you on the moisture. You'll think it's a lot drier than it actually is. So, yeah. Is there any other questions?
as far as owning equipment, right now I'm probably making enough hay to justify owning equipment. Years ago, I didn't make near enough hay to justify buying the baling stuff.
Yeah.
But when you're buying hay, probably custom guys, baling sailor that come to your farm and bale it. When my field's ready today, your field is too.
I know.
When he don't get to it for a week,
I'm not arguing with you. I know exactly what you're saying. I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, he's going to bale his hay first.
right, and then when he gets yours, I mean,
Yeah.
you might save money not on that equipment, but you got poor quality hay.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So that's why I bought my equipment years ago
Yeah.
and still do it.
So one of the things I didn't mention with buying hay that you need to think about too is that every ton of hay has about $30 to $35 worth of fertilizer in it. And when you buy that hay and bring it onto your farm, you're also bringing those nutrients onto your farm. So it's kind of like when you buy hay, you get a little bit of a coupon with it too, because you're bringing those nutrients into your grazing system. And you can build fertility over time. It's not the same as putting fertilizer on, but you're going to bring nutrients in over time. Every ton of hay has about 40 to 50 pounds of nitrogen in it, about 15 pounds of phosphate, and about 40 to 50 pounds of potash in it. So, all right. Well, thank you guys for having me. I enjoy coming up here.